Hello? Yeah, I think we can wait for another 2 or 3 minutes to wait for others to join the talk.
Good. I realized I should have worn some kind of GT shirt or like hoodie to advertise during this. I'm not a very good good advertiser.
Yeah, I'm not good. I'm not good at that.
Yeah, so for your next seminar, you should encourage the speaker to, have a shirt from their institution. Just be like, here's where I'm from. Yeah, I think it's pretty normal for people to kind of trickle in a little bit later, so that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe we can get started. So hello everyone, welcome to today's NLP seminar. And today we have Dr. Ian. Dr. Ian recently defended his thesis in the Human-Centered Computing PhD program at Georgia Tech. And now he's a visiting research investigator with the LIT lab at the University of Michigan. His research proposed computational approaches to understanding the sociolinguistic variation on social media. And Ian is currently interested in incorporating sociolinguistic insight into NLP models to address different speaker needs. Now let's welcome Ian and join his talk.
Cool. All right, thank you, Jal, and thanks to both you and Monica for having me. So you can still see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. I've done this before. Sometimes it cuts out randomly. So if it ever cuts out, just interrupt me and let me know so that I can fix it.
Okay.
Okay. So thanks everyone for coming. As Jal said, I'm really interested in sort of sociolinguistics, sort of what language tells us about society. And so today I'm going to be talking about what natural language processing can reveal about sociolinguistic variation, specifically looking at social media. So a lot of NLP research kind of comes at language from this assumption that language is kind of this static entity. It's kind of fixed. It doesn't really change depending on social groups. You kind of have like one model to rule them all that kind of just generates text or processes text regardless of the social context in which it's sort of happening. And we know for a fact that human language is actually not monolithic, but it really varies a lot through time and space. So for example, even in the US, where we think there's like, American English, there are many different dialects. So in the South, there's sort of, a very sort of unified dialect region, which is different from like the West, the North, and the Midwest, which is not random, but it's sort of predicated on different sort of social realities, like sort of migration patterns. And generally, my work kind of comes at language from the idea that people use language to achieve social goals and to construct social meaning in their everyday interpersonal interactions. So for example, in this talk, we'll be talking about a lot about multilingualism. And this is especially prominent in Canada, where French and English are two official languages. And politicians like Justin Trudeau are often expected to switch between English and French based on sort of where they are or who they're talking to. So for example, if he's talking to sort of French-speaking Canada, he might be expected to switch to French. If he's talking to sort of more English-speaking Canada, might be expected to switch to English. So this sort of alternation has been studied under the sort of framework of what's called language variation. So when communicating, people often have to choose between different linguistic forms that have sort of the same denotation but very different connotations. So for example, saying something even as simple as I'm going versus I'm going sort of signifies a difference in formality. You might say I'm going and pronounce it sort of like in the correct way to a sort of like professional audience, where you might say I'm going if you're talking to friends who you know are going to be sort of accepting of a sort of non-standard speech. While typical linguistics looks at these choices through a kind of cognitive lens, sort of what are people thinking, sociolinguistics tries to explain the social systems that govern these patterns of variation. So for example, looking at things like what makes a particular dialect different from other dialects, what makes a word sort of socially acceptable to say, and how do multilingual people choose between languages in everyday conversations. I give sort of an example here of the goin situation where in a very sort of, simplified world, a person talking to their close friend might be comfortable saying I'm goin', whereas a person talking to multiple colleagues or people who they're not necessarily familiar with might say I'm going as a way of sort of signifying formality. And so again, there are obviously sort of linguistic constraints here, but sociolinguistics is really interested in kind of the social constraints that help describe patterns of variation. And there's this really great quote. I do have a video I'm going to try to play, but I don't know if it'll work. There's this really great quote from Penelope Eckert that talks about language variation, saying that like the rest of language, variation does not simply reflect the social, but enacts it. And in the course of this enactment, it participates in social change. So even just sort of simple choices like choosing between, whether you're saying one word over another, can sort of help the sort of larger processes of social change. So I don't know if the audio is going to work.
There's just a clip from a movie called Mean Girls where they actually sort of address this concern head on. I'll try to play it for you all.
Oh, my mom made it. I love your bracelet. Where did you get it? Oh, my mom made it. Adorable. So fetch. What is fetch? Oh, it's like slang from England.
Okay, so there someone is kind of introducing this new word fetch and saying that it's slang, meaning like good. And later in the film, they end up using the word in a sort of different context.
Love them, and he totally complimented you. That is so fetch. Gretchen, stop trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen.
So that's kind of a silly example, but plug in my headphones again.
Just in case you couldn't hear it, there basically someone is really making an effort to sort of encourage their friends to adopt this new word called fetch, and it's sort of not really socially accepted and is eventually rejected. So this sort of choice of whether you use even just a slang word like fetch, can really tell us a lot about sort of the underlying social systems around language use. So this is an NLP talk. We talk a lot about data. Where does the data for this kind of analysis come from? So traditional sociolinguistics focuses pretty heavily on spoken data as kind of a way to study sort of spontaneous interactions between people in a way that's perhaps free from observer bias. So for example, a traditional study might interview people around a particular subject and try to elicit spontaneous sort of discussions, and then sort of use that data to understand deeper social systems like formality. So for example, on the left side, I'll try to get my laser pointer out. On the left side, there's this study about sort of audience awareness that tried to identify sort of formal and informal speech patterns just from sort of spoken recordings, where the first example, the speaker is sort of speaking more informally to a friend. In the second example, the speaker is kind of speaking more formally to a customer. This kind of analysis is definitely useful, and it's kind of formed the backbone of sociolinguistic research, but there's a lot of promise in kind of a written language as well, especially in a sort of large-scale systems like social media, where people often congregate to discuss topics and sort of express themselves. And so there's this kind of growing interest in computational techniques to sort of process this large amount of written data and use it to test kind of intuitive hypotheses about language variation. Excuse me. So for example, you might sort of take tweets that are written by Justin Trudeau and attempt to automatically identify the language that this person is using and try to come up with different hypotheses about what social constraints might explain whether he's choosing to use French or English. and use that to test some theory about, for example, audience awareness. So this sort of intersection is often called computational sociolinguistics, and the field is really interested in kind of methods that can help process and categorize often complicated language patterns in online discussions. And what's interesting is that this kind of work can unlock fundamentally different questions for sociolinguists than were previously available. So for example, we can look at things like how often do people code switch with friends versus with strangers. So, if I'm talking to a friend, how often do I switch to Spanish versus English? And sort of very large scale phenomenon that would take, a very long time to understand in the offline world, we can understand kind of in real time in the online world. So for example, what linguistic factors can help contribute to the success of a new word like fetch in an online discussion. And again, this requires sort of very robust computational methods to extract these patterns of variation and scale them up in a useful way. I show on the right side a sort of study that looked at code switching in minority languages in the Netherlands. And the sort of bottom graph shows that sort of over time, as a discussion sort of continues, people tend to switch to minority languages when they're talking to their friends, so Limburgish and Frisian, possibly as a result of kind of decreased formality and sort of allowing for more minority opinions to be expressed. And so this kind of analysis is really at a large scale only possible with NLP techniques that can help identify some of these patterns of variation. Okay. So you might be, there's a lot of different ways to talk about social media. One of them is the fact that social media is not a perfect representation of society. It's not everybody who has sort of access to a computer or a smartphone or even knows what Twitter is. However, it's important to note that social media does foster a healthy diversity of language patterns, if not social patterns. So for example, it's even though Twitter was founded in the United States, there is sort of a very sort of healthy diversity of languages on the platform. So even English, you would expect it to be majority, but it really isn't. There's sort of a long tail of other popular languages. And so these platforms really are kind of a great test bed for investigating sociolinguistic variation, especially for sort of everyday interactions that are kind of unimpeded by interviewers or by kind of observer bias. Okay, so if you'll permit me a metaphor, we can sort of allow social media to be this kind of imperfect mirror for society and assume that NLP techniques, things like dependency parsing, automatic language identification, verb conjugation, are kind of a polish for the mirror. And they can help us understand sort of deeper social constructs much better than what was previously sort of available. So that brings me to the sort of overall point of the talk, which is what does NLP sort of do for sociolinguistics? I argue that it does sort of three things really well. The first one is that NLP can give us access to very rare patterns that would otherwise take a long time to identify manually in, for example, spoken discourse. Secondly, NLP reveals the full variety of language choices that would otherwise appear very limited. Secondly, NLP, this is maybe the most methodologically interesting for people in this talk, NLP can help linguists capture very complex patterns in language sort of structure that would otherwise require difficult judgment. And so I've sort of leveraged these 3 points to varying degrees throughout my dissertation to kind of pull out what I think are really interesting hypotheses and ideas about sort of language variation. So that brings you to the outline of my talk. Hopefully I've convinced you of why sociolinguistics is interesting. I'll now talk about the different benefits of NLP for sociolinguistic research, and then sort of end with kind of zooming out, thinking about what NLP can do for social science and vice versa. Okay. So I want to start off by talking about what NLP can do for sort of rare patterns in speech. Okay. So many of these sort of language choices that I've been talking about, like goin versus going, that's a fairly common one. But a lot of them don't occur all the time and only occur really a few times in a given conversation, which makes sort of typical approaches to sort of spoken data a little bit tricky. For example, it's not a guaranteed, even in a multilingual discussion, that code switching will actually happen. You kind of have to observe it over a long period of time and among kind of a lot of different social contexts to sort of observe it in its sort of full variety. And this is a problem because sociolinguistics really requires robust data samples to test hypotheses about variation. So for example, to understand the different sort of audience effects of sort of language choices. You have to understand a speaker's sort of behavior in front of different audiences, which you can't really do with these typically rare phenomena. So fortunately, NLP can identify some of these patterns automatically in large data in order to uncover a large sample that people can use for analysis. So for example, in the sort of Justin Trudeau situation I was telling at the beginning, instead of interviewing a bunch of politicians and waiting for them to code switch, we can apply something like an automatic language identification to extract these sort of utterances automatically, and then use this to test kind of large-scale hypotheses about this otherwise very rare phenomenon. So for example, do politicians tend to, code switch in front of different audiences or to express their identity? And so some of these rare patterns relate to multilingualism. As I've sort of said before, and hopefully it's kind of apparent, speakers often have to choose between languages, not just based on what they know about the different languages, so how much I know about Spanish, but also based on their social goals, so sort of what they expect their listeners to take away from their utterance. And code switching is fairly common in social media. There's been a lot of work looking at sort of how common it is across countries and across sort of different regions. And it's also, it's not sort of perfectly detected, but it is readily detected using language identification algorithms, especially character level identification algorithms. And identifying this behavior is not just useful for building better NLP, it's also great to help us test very subtle questions that require a lot of data, especially around speaker attitude. So I'll give an example here of a speaker who is choosing between two different languages in Spain. One is Spanish, the majority language, and the other one is Catalan, a minority language. So sort of using NLP, we can collect sufficient data to test this idea that sort of someone who has previously expressed a pro-Catalonia opinion, so Catalonia is the region where Catalan, the language, is spoken, someone who expresses that opinion may be more likely to choose the language associated with that region as opposed to Spanish, even though they know both languages very well. So this brings me to sort of the first work in this direction, which is a paper at NACL 2018, looking at the use of Catalan versus Spanish in political discussions. So as I mentioned before, multilingualism is definitely super interesting to sociolinguists, and it really comes to the forefront in discussions about identity. So, if you identify with a particular place or an idea, you might the language that you choose to use might be tied up with that identity. And in this study, we looked at politics. So Catalonia, a region in Spain, has had a strong sort of independence movement that was often tied to language use. So I show kind of pictures of protests that happened in the region that had this sort of nicely encapsulated, where on the left side, there's sort of a pro-independence protest with a sign written in Catalan. On the right side is a protest with a sign written in Spanish. So kind of identifying this divide between different attitudes and language choices. So we took this idea and applied it to the context of social media and looked at how local language use correlates with political attitudes within sort of an independence movement. So just as an example, we leveraged language identification to identify with fairly high confidence whether tweets were written in Spanish or Catalan, either on the pro-independence side, which you can see just kind of quickly tends to have a little bit more Catalan language. On the anti-independent side, tweets tend to be almost sort of categorically written in Spanish. The content is not super important, but basically the pro-independence tweets identified by their hashtags are indeed sort of expressing sentiment about Catalonia as a region being independent, which is opposite from the anti side. And so we leveraged automatic language identification to kind of test this idea about attitude, and we compared it to previous work that looked at a similar case, but in Scotland. So I'll go over those results a little bit quickly. So the main dependent variable here was at the speaker level, whether or not they chose to use Catalan or Spanish. And we assumed that sort of people who are pro-independence would tend to use more Catalan because it was kind of bound up with the idea of sort of regional independence. And that was what we found. So comparing this with the previous sort of Scottish independence case, we found that they tended to align. So pro-independent speakers tend to choose the minority language more often than anti-independent speakers, suggesting that the sort of political identity associated with these languages is kind of similar. And again, you could sort of get at this with interviews, but it would be difficult to kind of sort of scale this up and identify this sort of connection that would otherwise be kind of rare. In addition, we looked at speakers choosing between these languages based on topic. So whether or not they were talking about the sort of political independence movement, or if they were talking about other things like sports or weather. And interestingly, we found that on the Catalan side, that the speakers tended to choose the minority language more often than in any kind of independence discussion, as opposed to in the control discussion. So if they're talking about independence, they're probably going to use Catalan. And this is the opposite of the other study, the Scots study, which found that people tended to use Scots, the minority language, less often when they're talking about the independence referendum. So it's actually this really interesting wrinkle that suggests that the sort of political value of Catalan is just qualitatively different from Scots. And again, this is something that you could get at through kind of very careful interview studies or through kind of participant observation. But using social media and NLP, we can kind of crack this question empirically, which is pretty cool. And so this kind of study helps us identify the role of speaker attitudes in sort of multilingual choices, which we followed up with another study about loanwords. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but I will briefly overview that. So as I was mentioning before, language choices often reflect kind of latent attitudes that people hold about countries or about regions or about ideas. And for example, loanwords are words that are borrowed between languages. So English borrows a lot from Spanish, for example, like burrito or salsa. And there's this kind of notion that loanwords can be tied to sort of cultural attitudes. So for example, a speaker may adopt more English loanwords if they feel kind of aligned to a different culture. And sort of the same point I've been saying about rarity, loanwords are very rare in spoken conversations, but NLP can help us identify a large sample of sort of loanword use using automatic language identification. And I just give an example of a loanword here. We have the word tweet, which was adopted from English, like to post something on Twitter, which became fairly popular from 2008 onward as a result of the site becoming more popular, and potentially from sort of Spanish-speaking people becoming more open to the idea of talking about Twitter openly. So this is a work in progress, looking at not just the use of loanwords, but whether they're kind of treated differently in terms of grammar. So one thing that's interesting about loanwords is that speakers don't always adopt them kind of as they are, but they often integrate them in order to align to the grammar of their native language. So I give an example here of this loanword tweet, again from English, and it's being used in Spanish. And there's a couple different ways for a speaker to reference the idea that, like, I'm sending a tweet. There's different variants for that. One of them is to say just as a single verb to tweet, where the word is actually integrated with the native morphology, EAR. So this is like just a single verb. In another example, a speaker can say to send a tweet, which is used in this kind of paraphrastic phrase, which is not necessarily connected to native morphology. So we consider this sort of less integrated because it's not directly connected to morphology. And there's been some sociolinguistic work sort of trying to understand the role of different attitudes toward this process of integration. So there's one kind of intuitive hypothesis that speakers tend to use these integrated forms, like the one down here, if they are more sort of linguistically conservative. And it's kind of an open question about whether this applies to cultural attitudes in general. So if a speaker is sort of culturally very aligned to English-speaking culture, are they going to integrate the loanword, use it in this kind of like prescriptively correct sense, or are they going to use it in the more informal or the less integrated sense? So this kind of piggybacks on the previous study looking at political attitude, whereas this one looks at cultural attitudes. And sort of similar to before, even though loanwords are extremely rare in spoken conversation, we're able to extract a fairly large sample using automatic language identification. So here, taking a sample of tweets, processing it through LangID, filtering it to only tweets with high confidence that also contain a loanword. We're able to identify a surprising diversity of loanwords that kind of pop out of the data. So things like the word like, where that means, if I like a photo on social media, I might use that verb, or things like flip. So, if I flip out, then I might say like I'm flipping, as well as tweet. We talked about that before. And again, you'd be kind of hard pressed to find a lot of these in like spoken conversation, but thanks to automatic language identification, we can really scale up our analysis and do some really interesting kind of speaker level sort of testing about attitudes. The first test that we run just looks at sort of different domains. We look at the rate of integrated word use in newspapers and in social media. So part of the data we collect is from newspapers in addition to social media. And those are from Latin America, Europe, and the US. And we do this test because we assume that newspapers kind of have a very different latent approach to sort of incorporating loanwords. If newspapers have kind of a higher writing standard, they have editors, they might be more likely to use the more formal version of the word, which is what we find. We find that newspapers do tend to use these integrated verbs like to tweet at a much higher rate than social media, which suggests that this process of verb or loanword integration does relate to formality. So, if newspapers are generally considered more formal places for people to write, then they might be sort of pressured to use the more formal form of the loanword, and which could reference some conservative cultural attitude. So that's kind of a baseline for, what does verb integration mean in terms of attitude. In addition, we did some testing that looked at just social media users and tried to differentiate them based on their assumed attitudes. And we tried to differentiate this based on musical sharing. So people who tend to share a lot of music by Spanish or Latin American artists, we sort of label them as more Spanish, more like aligned towards Spanish-speaking culture, as opposed to the opposite. People who tend to share more English or US-speaking music tend to align to more English-speaking culture. And we try to test this with the same sort of test, does this explain whether people choose the integrated form or not of the loanword? But we find that it actually does not explain the level of integration for loanwords, but it does for native verbs. So native verbs, things like, to buy or to dream, are things that they didn't have to borrow, that were just part of the language. And so one possible reason for this discrepancy is that native verbs might be sort of more well-known among speakers and may sort of have a stronger connection to cultural attitudes, as opposed to loanwords, which aren't necessarily acquired natively. You have to you learn those later in life. So those might have a less strong connection to cultural attitudes, at least on social media. Get that. So just to summarize this second study in kind of like attitude work, we found that the sort of integration of verbs in general in Spanish is considered more formal. And this, even though the sort of cultural attitude didn't pan out, this overall work does show that social factors like register or some of the other results I couldn't show do actually matter a lot for what other people might consider to be a grammatical decision. Do you use it in the kind of like morphologically integrated sense or the not sense, that some people might consider that just like a linguistic choice. But this work shows that it really is predicated on a lot of different social factors. More to the point of this talk, NLP was extremely useful in how it helped to magnify this very rare multilingual phenomenon on social media that otherwise take either a lot of surveys or interview data or experiments to kind of elicit these loanwords. So NLP can provide a huge sort of benefit to sociolinguists in this kind of work. So that was focusing on rare patterns. I want to talk a little bit about how NLP can identify a variety of patterns as well. So in contrast to what I was talking about before, some patterns of language variation are fairly common. For example, this pattern of having a name followed by some descriptive information like Atlanta, Georgia, that alternation between either Atlanta, Georgia and Atlanta by itself is fairly common, but they're sort of difficult to observe in their full variety. So you could try to enumerate yourself all the different versions of name plus description, just like writing it out. But that is extremely difficult and arguably impossible. So NLP can help us a lot because it can capture the full variety of a pattern with very generic representations that would otherwise be kind of difficult to use. So for example, we can use dependency parsing to go through text and identify sort of consistent use of a name plus descriptive information. So name plus some subclause, name plus some subclause, but then to also eliminate false positives like Atlanta and Georgia, where even though Atlanta and Georgia co-occur, Georgia is not being used to describe Atlanta because it's not a subclause. So NLP can really help us identify a variety of different sort of instantiations of the same pattern. So you might be wondering, okay, why are we talking about this? This is really important for understanding kind of people's expectations of their audience when they're writing, which can in turn help us understand sort of the collective attention being paid to a particular entity like Atlanta. So named entities like Atlanta or like location names often are talked about in the news, and writers often have to make this sort of social choice about whether to add more or less descriptive information based on what they think that their audience is going to be familiar with. So the first time that Bill Clinton was mentioned in the New York Times, what this plot on the left shows is the mentions of Bill Clinton, and the y-axis is how long sort of the descriptor information for Bill Clinton was. The first time he was mentioned, he did require descriptor information, like the governor of Arkansas, but that over time, as the writers continued to write about Bill Clinton, they presumably assumed that their audience would be familiar with who Bill Clinton is. He's the president of the US at the time. And so they tended to drop descriptor information and just say, Bill Clinton said this. So even if it seems like kind of an arbitrary choice, sort of at a macro scale, it can actually tell us a lot about sort of people shifting expectations about what they think their audience will understand. And this doesn't affect just newspaper writing like in the New York Times. This also happens all the time in news discussions online. So I show an example here from our work where we are looking at San Juan, which is the capital of Puerto Rico, or a territory of the US. And we were specifically looking at discussions of hurricanes that struck the US. And after Hurricane Maria struck the US in 2017, it really hit Puerto Rico pretty hard. And as a result, people started to talk about things related to Puerto Rico a lot more, including San Juan. And what's interesting is that sort of like the Bill Clinton example, over time, this is a plot showing the discussion of San Juan. The dark line is frequency. The dotted line is the likelihood of seeing any kind of descriptor information. We found that over time, people tended to drop descriptors for San Juan. So in the early stages of the event, people often said, San Juan, Puerto Rico, whereas in later stages, they tended to say just San Juan. And so this is a really interesting kind of sociolinguistic, variation that reflects how much they expect their audiences to know about a particular event that's happening. So overall, this goal looked at descriptor information as kind of this way of measuring people's reaction to crisis events like hurricanes that often attract a lot of discussion on social media. So where the NLP comes in is, like I said before, on the syntax side, as well as a bunch of other things. So first, in this kind of analysis, you have to extract named entities, so things like San Juan and Puerto Rico. You have to match them in some knowledge base. So identify these named entities. The second step, you have to parse the sentence. So add some dependency parser, which for Spanish is not great, but in this case study, it was good enough. You parse the sentence, and you try to identify descriptive information based on sort of the presence of additional named entities. So in this example, since the named entity San Juan is followed by the descriptor phrase, the capital of Puerto Rico, we call it a descriptor because it contains some anchor entity like Puerto Rico that is larger than San Juan and can help the audience understand sort of where San Juan is sort of in relation to the rest of the world. And so again, understanding the full variety of these kinds of patterns, like San Juan, Puerto Rico, the capital of Puerto Rico, like all that variety, you could try to enumerate that. But NLP prevents or sort of helps you avoid having to do that with these very generic parse representations. So in this study, we looked at data from Facebook as well as from Twitter that discussed reactions to a variety of hurricanes, like Hurricane Maria, like I mentioned before, as well as 5 that struck the US from 2017 to 2018. And we were interested in both time as a factor as well as different sort of social factors that could explain the amount of sort of variation in descriptor use. I'll just go over a couple of the effects that we found. The most intuitive one was that authors tend to add descriptor information for locations that are not local to their particular discussion. So what does that mean? So on Facebook, there are different groups associated with different locations. So Puerto Rico is split up into a lot of different municipalities. There was one group for Lajas, there was one group for Guayama. And we found that people, when they were talking about, for example, Lajas, they tended to drop descriptor information when they were actually local to the group. Whereas when they were not local to the group, they tended to add descriptor information, which kind of matches the intuition that people know who their audience is, and they shape their language choices accordingly. In addition, like I said before, we looked at time as a variable, where we sort of counted time as like relative. So for every named entity, like San Juan, we broke it up into sort of different discrete periods, like whether it's before the peak in frequency, during the peak in frequency, or after the peak in frequency. And we found that overwhelmingly, authors on social media tend to drop descriptors after the peak and post volume for a given entity. And this is, I show San Juan, but I want to show it's not just a sort of cherry-picked example. We saw it even for sort of less popular locations like Myrtle Beach, where again, the dotted line is the probability of descriptor. And we found that this did tend to decrease after the peak in post frequency, kind of at the middle of the hurricane. But I think I'll go, okay, yeah, I'll do one more. So in addition to kind of all the authors on social media, we also looked at very highly active authors like news accounts. And we found, interestingly, that the same time effect that we specified here, so like before, during, after the peak, that didn't apply to these highly active accounts. But what did apply was the fact that these accounts tended to drop descriptors after they themselves had mentioned the location a lot. So an account like CBS Evening News that was covering Hurricane Irma in Florida would kind of early on mention things like Jacksonville, Florida, but only after having mentioned that location frequently would in later tweets tend to drop descriptors for that same location. There's a lot of different possible reasons for this, one of them being that these highly active accounts tend to pay more attention to what they're saying as opposed to kind of the overall discussion. We can't infer causality, but this does sort of differentiate, does sort of suggest that different kinds of speakers sort of have different qualitative expectations for their audiences that is then sort of expressed in how they use descriptors. So the takeaway from this study was that authors tend to modulate their use of descriptor information on social media for these named entities in a way that can help them accommodate a variety of communication needs for their audience, which is especially important in crisis events, where communication often has to happen quickly for people to make decisions. More to the point of this talk, NLP is really helpful in this kind of work because it can help address the variety of different descriptor forms that relate to the same underlying pattern of variation, which again would be very difficult to enumerate kind of just exhaustively. So far we've talked about how NLP is really great for sociolinguistics because it can help identify rare patterns, it can help identify a variety of patterns. Lastly, I want to talk about how it can identify sort of qualitatively complex patterns. Okay, I'll take a quick sip of water. So some aspects of language variation are very theoretically interesting and are very easy to intuitively understand, but they're often difficult to quantify without a lot of assumptions. So one aspect of language variation that people study a lot is change. So if there's a new word in a particular speech community, what makes it likely to kind of get picked up by the rest of the speech community? You know, what makes it stick? Like the fetch example I tried to give at the beginning of the talk where someone was trying to make a word stick in a community. One sort of factor that is easy to intuitively understand but often difficult to quantify is how linguistically useful a word is. So if there's a new word like fetch, which I show on the right here, and we see that it is very sort of inherently useful. You know, you can use fetch as a predicate adjective, you can use it as an attributive adjective, you can use it as an interjection. You know, we intuitively understand, okay, that this word is very useful and maybe that will contribute to its success. But often identifying or sort of nailing down what it means to be useful can be sort of difficult qualitatively. Fortunately, NLP provides sort of rigid constructs to identify this kind of utility. And it provides statistical methods that can help capture some of these squishy constructs that can help explain patterns of variation. So for example, you may have some NLP system that is a sort of very fine-grained part of speech tagger, which can go through a corpus and identify different uses of fetch, and sort of identify the fact that fetch is being used in very different ways, as a predicate adjective, attributive adjective, or an interjection, and sort of use that to make the inference that this new word is very useful and therefore likely to be adopted in a speech community. So that brings me to the last study in this talk, which was at EMNLP 2018, looking at word adoption and abandonment in online communities. So to anyone who uses the internet, probably not surprising that new words come and go constantly in online communities like Reddit or Twitter due to the turnover in membership and the need for new conventions to fill a particular role. And not all words last. So a lot of sociolinguists are interested in sort of comparing what makes one word outlast its competitor words. So for example, there are sort of different ways to use intensifiers. There's AF and ASF as F. And there's different sort of factors that can contribute to one winning over the other. And so this study looked at two different factors, so social dissemination and linguistic dissemination. So on the left side, if the word AF is spread among a lot of different social contexts, like different subreddits, that might be useful, but it also might be useful if AF is spread among a lot of different linguistic contexts. So like you're funny AF, it's hot AF, sweet AF, bro. And so this study tried to compare these factors directly using statistical methods to kind of quantify these different constructs. If that, so you might be wondering, okay, how are you actually going to quantify this idea of linguistic utility? One way of doing that is to identify the different number of contexts that a word occurs in, and then compare that number to some expected count. So in this case, we looked at the number of trigram contexts that a particular word like AF occurs in. So in this case, these are 3 different trigram contexts, and then normalizing that by some expected count based on the frequency of the word, under the assumption that very frequent words also tend to occur in a lot of different trigram contexts. So ideally, this kind of metric would identify words that are kind of unusually linguistically useful, at least according to how many contexts they occur in. So I give an example here where we compute this metric just by fitting a linear fit between the probability, the frequency of a word and the number of trigrams in which a word occurs. Excuse me. And the metric of interest is the difference between the expected and observed count. So here we see a word like AKA tends to occur in an unusually high number of trigram contexts, which is not surprising since AKA can occur before pretty much any name, it means also known as, so it's very sort of linguistically diverse, which is different from a word like yikes, which occurs in a very low number of trigram contexts according to the expected count, which kind of makes sense since yikes is kind of an interjection that often occurs at the end of a sentence. So now that we have this kind of metric, we can use it to sort of predict whether or not a word will succeed or fail in the future. So the main task of this work was to, given a pair of words like LMAO or hee-hee, sort of laughter words, for example, can we predict whether a given word is going to grow or decline in the future based on its early levels of either social dissemination or linguistic dissemination? And we find overwhelmingly that, I don't have time to talk about all the results, but one of them is that linguistic dissemination is overwhelmingly a strong predictor of sort of word success. So we show that with predictive tasks like this one, where we're using logistic regression to predict whether or not a word will succeed or fail in the future based on its current level of frequency, its current level of linguistic dissemination, and its current level of social dissemination. We find that the models that incorporate the linguistic information, so these 2 dotted lines up on the top, tend to outperform the models that don't. So through a couple different analyses, we find sort of repeatedly that this idea of linguistic utility or dissemination is actually extremely useful in predicting word success and decline. So as I said before, linguistic dissemination is actually very useful. And more to the point of this talk, NLP helps quantify this very complex idea of linguistic utility in order to better analyze and understand language change in a way that was kind of previously unavailable. I only have a few minutes left, so I'd like to sort of wrap up. So just to really hammer home the points of this talk, NLP is really useful for sociolinguistic research in a lot of ways. One of them is that it gives us access to rare patterns that are otherwise difficult to identify manually. NLP helps reveal the full variety of language choices that would otherwise appear limited. And lastly, NLP can help linguists capture complex patterns that would otherwise require difficult judgment or sort of qualitative analysis. So now that I've talked about that, I'd like to wrap up by discussing a few points that NLP can offer for sort of sociolinguistics and social science more broadly, as well as the opposite direction. Okay. So you might be wondering what sociolinguistics type researchers might need from NLP. One sort of vein of interest here is looking at improving accuracy of or representation power of things like semantics, sort of representations. So as I said before, language variation is often concerned with change over time, and one form of change is kind of semantic change. So for example, on the right side, there's this different distributions of senses for the same word disk. You know, in the first sort of green sense, it's being used as kind of a tool. In the second orange sense, it's being used as kind of a computer disk. And so the changes in these sense distributions over time is not random. It's actually tied to sort of social change, you know, the adoption of computers over time. And this kind of analysis is possible through improved semantic representations. So from the NLP side, it would be you know, extremely useful to sociolinguists to improve these kind of semantic representations for more fine-grained analysis of kind of social change over time. More broadly, if anyone on the call is more of a social science person as opposed to sociolinguistics, there is a growing interest in kind of what NLP can do for social science. And good social science really requires accurate measurements of constructs that are often very complicated. So for example, I've talked about attitudes before. It requires sort of very robust representations of attitudes. It requires sort of inferring relationships between people. It can often require inferring sort of deception, so whether a person online is trying to deceive other people. And surveys and interviews can address these constructs, but often not at scale and not in rapidly changing environments like social media, where, for example, fake news might crop up very quickly. And so where NLP comes in is that NLP can help extract some of these complicated social constructs from text in order to boost the sort of analytical power of social science research. And two different sort of things that would be really useful from NLP systems for social science researchers are both estimates of uncertainty. So, you know, instead of labeling a tweet as positive or negative, saying how, you know, what's the certainty that this tweet is positive or negative, as well as explanations. So not just saying, again, whether a tweet is positive or negative, but sort of identifying features in the tweet that, you know, can help understand the reason for that judgment. So for example, if we have, you know, some utterances related to COVID, and we're interested in kind of how people are responding to COVID happening, you might imagine there, you know, a social scientist would maybe want a text system that could extract information from a statement like this. Actually, COVID-19 has really messed up my life, and identify things like there's a 90% chance that this tweet is negative, and also there's a 50% chance that this person is willing just to disclose potentially sensitive information, both of which are very useful in kind of understanding sort of social psychology responses to difficult life events. And again, this is only possible through sort of more powerful and more interpretable NLP systems. I'm a little over time, but I want to go one last point, which is that to flip all this, you might be wondering, okay, we've talked about like what sort of social science, sociolinguistics needs from NLP. What about the other way? So what can NLP learn from sociolinguistics? So as I said at the start of this talk, traditional NLP is focused on representing language models using only the text of an utterance, and often assumes that language is just generated without any kind of social context. So again, you know, you might go to GPT-3, give it a prompt, and just sort of have some text generated without any notion of who's going to be reading it or who is assumed to be writing it. Recent work has tried to counter this by incorporating demographics into NLP models for better performance. So for example, trying to model part of speech tagging in a more accurate way based on the writer's gender. And I want to argue that we can push much, much farther than this. Sociolinguistics is amazing because it provides a lot of sort of constructs in terms of interactions that can inform language modeling. So for example, things like your audience. So sort of who the language model is talking to, relationships, what the inferred relationship is between people, community norms. So if you release, some language model as a moderator, how do you kind of inform it about the norms of that community in a socially responsible way? And sociolinguistics is, a discipline that can really provide some of these constructs to NLP models. So for example, the sort of more socially aware NLP system might take some information about the listener, like their self-reported gender, and condition their responses appropriately. Or it might take information about how many people are in their audience, and again, say something like, hey, y'all, instead of hey, you, to sort of indicate that they're talking to a larger number of people. So this is obviously, there's nothing quantitative, the resulting quantitative results here. It's all just kind of speculative. But I think that NLP can learn a lot from kind of sociolinguistic research and potentially not just make more accurate systems, but also more responsible systems. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask them now, or you want to email me later, that's also great. And if you're interested in this kind of computational sociolinguistic work, there is currently a special issue of Frontiers in AI that has published about 20 different articles that are really awesome. So if you want to read more about this, go check it out at that journal. But otherwise, thank you for listening. Thank you. Applause.
Yeah, so like if you have any questions, you can post them in the QA section and we can ask Ian about them.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of like building social aware NLP models, like to integrate like the relations audience into like maybe like language models or just some generation models. Yeah, that's really important.
Definitely. It is, yeah. The tricky thing about it that I didn't bring up is that it requires a lot of data.
Right,
so you have to like, get labels for things like, what's your audience size, what's your composition, what's your intent. So I think that there are some data sets that do that, but I think scaling that up is going to be really tricky. And it's, especially going beyond demographics, which are sort of a little bit like easier to like quantify. More like difficult things like community norms or like audience are sort of, we don't have great like data sets or tasks for that, at least as far as I'm aware of. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yes. Yeah, and like maybe like the data set is more sparse, like for each category there won't be much data.
Yeah, that's like a problem with, I think, socially oriented NLP in general, is that like to get the most like socially accurate representation, it often becomes very like fine grained, like you're saying. So, not just how big your audience is, but like who is in your audience, what time of day you're posting, like lots of different aspects of that. And also, I guess I kind of framed this as like chatbots specifically, but there's definitely a lot of different other kinds of ways to think about this. So one of them is like a translation. So, if you're like scrolling through Twitter and you need something translated, sort of the most accurate translation may definitely depend on the speaker's identity, as opposed to just, what like word for word the utterance means. So like, for example, I guess the sort of example is, often relates to semantics. So the word, I'm kind of blanking here. Cricket, for example, in US English, we would often think of that as like an insect. In other dialects, they might think of it as the sport.
Right.
So sort of based on where the speaker is coming from, you might want to translate that differently. Again, it's kind of making like a strong assumption, but it does do a better job at integrating like the speaker's background.
Yeah.
So basically, like, text generation is just one example of sort of ways where like more social information does sort of help give background. I think there's a QA now, so I'll try to answer that.
Yeah. So Monica just asked for talks, saying like you use a lot of NLP tools for non-English languages and even different styles of English. Any comments on how good the existing tools are for those cases?
Oh my gosh, so many thoughts on that. I had that as a very brief point here, where at least in our analysis, the LangID algorithm did work fairly well, but that was because we focused on like very well-resourced languages like Catalan and Spanish. In more Sort of under-resourced languages, especially languages of India, they often do much worse. And even within English, there's really high rates of disparity. So if you're looking at African American English, which is a dialect of English, there is this kind of noted phenomenon that a lot of tools do perform worse, presumably because they were kind of trained on standard English. So that's definitely another area where NLP can help, is to sort of improve that coverage and to improve the accuracy of those tools for sort of better analysis, especially for like dialects. Yeah.
Okay.
I will say that the parsers were pretty good for English and Spanish. They tended to work surprisingly well, which I generally think of parsers as like kind of brittle. So good job, Google.
Yeah. I guess I have like a small questions about like the integrated verbs.
Mm-hmm.
So in that work you mentioned like there are some like less integrated verbs and more integrated verbs. So are there any criteria to make that categories, and like do you like merge them together for analysis, or you treat them separately in your analysis?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, we treat these like we sort of treat it as a binary. So we just say, for a given loan word, is it integrated or is it not integrated? But that is a very simplified version of how words actually work. There's kind of, when it comes to loan words, there's like a spectrum. So it's really not just, one or other. It's kind of, people have a lot of choices of how to use a loan word. So, for example, in our analysis, like I said before, our analysis is binary. In other analyses, they look at sort of a continuous spectrum. One way this is useful is in pronunciation. So there's lots of different ways to say, for example, the word Iraq, which is a country in the Middle East. And you can think about this as a loan word that is either less or more integrated into a language. So depending on how many sounds you change in that word, it becomes kind of more or less integrated. So like Iraq, for example, is like more like closer to American English than Iraq. And Iraq is arguably even closer to American English than Iraq. So then in that case, with pronunciation of the word Iraq, the kind of spectrum of integration becomes continuous as opposed to binary, one or the other. So definitely that's a decision that you have to make as kind of a linguist. Do I want to treat this as like a binary, or do I want to treat it as more of like a spectrum?
Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Let's see.
Yeah, and I also like when you are doing a lesson, like how like cultural environment affect like the usage of like the integrated verbs or native verbs. Do you find that like the cultural environment does not like make a positive effect on the choices? Yeah. Do you have you like explored other like factors like the ages or genders?
That's a good question. We looked at, I didn't have time for it, but we looked at language use and geography. So how much prior Spanish somebody used and what region of the world that they reported to be from. We found that those were actually significant. So we found that people who tended to use a lot of Spanish in their previous tweets tended to use the integrated form, for example, which kind of aligns with the idea that people who use a lot of Spanish are more sort of conservative, maybe less likely to switch into English. So yeah, we did have a couple more like demographic findings.
Yeah, here's comes another question. So hi Ian, thanks for talking. I'm curious to know what NLP tools did you use for multilingual tasks?
Oh yeah, mainly we use language ID. So lang ID is this awesome character-based algorithm that identifies with high accuracy the overall language of a post. But for the descriptor study, we had to use a couple different parsers, and those were all monolingual. So it was, I think we used like SyntaxNet for English and Spacey, the sort of Spacey parser for Spanish, just based on like performance across some sort of small annotated data sets. But I think one thing I forgot to mention, I think there's a lot of promise for multilingual language models. So you've seen probably a lot of like BERT, for example, for multiple languages. And I think there's a lot of promise there in terms of identifying, actual cases of code switching within the same like tweet, for example, in a way that we didn't really do here. We tried to stick to fairly simple models that were easy to kind of debug. So yeah, we mainly use, like I said, LangID, a couple different parsers. And for the loanword study, we also used a really great a rule-based system to conjugate verbs. So to take a word like to tweet and then to automatically generate all of the different conjugations of it in Spanish. So those are kind of the three big tools we use for multilingual stuff. Good question.
Okay, cool. Let's thank Ian again for this great talk. And we'll have the NLP seminar in 2 weeks, and the next talk is from Martin Say from the University of Washington. So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Ian for the talk.
Well, thanks everyone for listening.
Cool. See you in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.